Before introducing our discussion, I would like to invite you to have coffee, words of yours. Please. You have very fine audience and some experts, you know, who will be listening to you. Well, welcome to the Institute of International Studies. Welcome online. Forward also. Welcome. It's a real pleasure to have Professor Paparinskis, a well-known, very young jurist, I must say, and who is participating in a regional program organized by the United Nations and found his time to come to the university. And we decided to organize this at the Institute of International Studies to have the possibility to share views with the persons who belong to different centers, the academia, students, practitioners, and so on. He will be, he's also a member of the International Law Commission. That is something that wasn't in the invitation. But I must say that he has been very generous with his teaching, and he would like to reflect together with you on how to strengthen the functions of international law through the work of the International Law Commission, which is a comprehensive title, but at the same time, it will go in depth into certain topics that the Commission is addressing. So thank you very much for accepting this invitation. It's a real honor to have you here. You have to. Yes.
Well, thank you very much.
Are you comfortable here?
I'm extremely. I'm very happy, very comfortable.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the very kind words of introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here, and delighted to see such a full and online audience. My presentation falls essentially in two parts. And I think the overall theme is that I would want to suggest some points that are perhaps more obvious, some things that might be reflective of my own experience on the International Law Commission for the last 2 years, and also just to bring us all up to speed to what the Commission is doing now and what it has done recently. I think the sense is that that will give us enough time and material for a lively and robust discussion, because of course on many of these points there is a degree of reasonable disagreement. Essentially, I want to first say a few things about the International Law Commission as such, to bring us all to the same speed, and then go more deeply on particular issues on the current agenda. Starting with a picture, that is the new composition of the International Law Commission for the 2023-2027 quinquennium. The picture was taken last year, and very careful watchers will know that it is already inaccurate because our member, Mr. Bogdan Areshchuk, has been elected to the International Court of Justice. So the gentleman almost at the middle of the third row is now on the International Court. And as his replacement, we elected for the casual vacancy, Ms. Alina Orosan, the legal advisor of the Romanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But also share a secret that this is partly a skillful working of Photoshop, because it was impossible to arrange all the ILC members to be in the room at the same time. So there are at least 3 who have been Photoshopped in. Actually, interesting game of trying to figure out who is Photoshopped in and who is genuinely in the room. So what is the International Law Commission? As a general technical institutional law proposition, it is a subsidiary organ of the UN General Assembly. And I imagine that as international lawyers, we have all made that phrase in the introduction of many a class, but actually, it is important. International Law Commission does not float in outer space. International Law Commission is an institution within the setting of the United Nations, General Assembly. And so its qualities, assessments, and failures have to be judged against the background of the United Nations of the time and of the broader international law of the time. That, I have to say, is perhaps the bigger takeaway that I have had after these 2 years, perhaps the clear appreciation of how deeply International Law Commission is entrenched with the General Assembly, how important it is that ILC members are elected by the General Assembly, how important it is that they are elected within strictly delineated regional groups. That is a very important element of the universalism of the International Law Commission. In that sense, it is different from the International Court of Justice, whereas we know there are traditionally allocated seats, but ultimately, legally speaking, it is electoral vote that drives and delineates these results. So that is not the case in the International Law Commission. Regional representation is a necessary aspect there. There are many things that the International Law Commission does, and that is, again, perhaps one of those points that I was aware in a more abstract sense, but perhaps projecting my own intellectual perspectives, I was probably mostly thinking of what the International Law Commission does with an eye to the Great Codification projects, law of treaties, Geneva Convention on Law of the Sea, diplomatic consular relations, of course, state responsibility. So, in a sense, articles as the normal form of the output in the traditional times during the Cold War, forming the basis for international conferences that adopt these documents. More recently, as the 2001 articles on state responsibility for internationally wrongful acts being taken note of and commended by the General Assembly. But there are many other forms of output that are being used by the International Law Commission. So more recently, quite a few things have been expressed in the form of conclusions. Conclusions on identification of customary international law. Conclusions on interpretation of treaties by reference to subsequent practice and agreement. Draft conclusions on use organs. Principles. Principles on environmental protection and armed conflict, for example, guidelines, reports, and of course, still draft articles on crimes against humanity, draft articles of protection of persons in the events of disasters. So there's a great deal of subtlety in the form of outputs that is elaborated and reflected upon with an eye to the topic. I think sometimes also aesthetic preferences of rapporteurs. What do they think fits best their own approach and their own style? And so if you look at it from the perspective of states, one element of feedback that states make in the Sixth Committee is that states would sometimes find more helpful to have greater clarity. So what is the difference between articles, conclusions, principles, guidelines, reports? Is that an aesthetic choice? Sort of, we are familiar with the idea that treaties may be called many things, but in a legal sense, a covenant, a charter, an agreement, and a treaty will be a treaty. It's perfectly fine to have an aesthetic judgment in international law. Or is that something that necessarily connotates certain juridical implications? That is an ongoing discussion to which International Law Commission has not given an entirely clear answer. And there are also a variety of figures in the architecture of the International Law Commission. The Chair Commission, who drives the discussion, special rapporteurs who come with their reports that start the discussion. There are also important study groups and working groups, and we'll come to the C-level rise as a particularly influential one. And also a figure, the chairperson of the drafting committee, who chairs the drafting discussion within which the provisions are elaborated. So I think, the sense of the procedural and practical realities and dynamic shape very much what International Law Commission can do and what can be expected of it. So some, I think, points are already made here, but perhaps just to drive home the importance, and I hope that perhaps that the slide might be big enough that the excerpt from 1998 annual report, which sets out the criteria for selection of topics. And it says the topic should reflect the needs of states. It should be sufficiently advanced in stage in terms of state practice to permit development of codification, and it should be concrete and feasible enough for progressive development and codification. And then the fourth, sort of a bit of a coda, the idea of openness to new topics. And that I think is also an important point, that the topics are not picked up for sheer intellectual pursuit, although of course they are incredibly intellectually exciting. It is something that fits within the institutional fabric of the General Assembly. Needs of states, sufficiency of state practice, ability to come up with a product. So it reflects a certain conception of the mandate and the function of the International Law Commission to serve as some have described it, as a think tank of the General Assembly. There are, of course, broader constituencies, but the formation of the Commission and operation of the Commission is geared towards states there. And that, it sort of makes sense, I suppose, tracing backwards. What sort of things should Commission be doing are the sort of things that an institution functioning and created in a certain manner would do. So lawyers are the people who sit in the Commission. So the topics should be lawyerly, legal, or predominantly legal. Those are topics that benefit from engagement with perspectives of states. Now, to be clear, it doesn't mean that the only things important in international law are things that are of interest to states and that are formally legal. But in this particular setting, it does make sense to focus on them. There are many other places in the international legal order where different people do different things. Here, the particular added value is for such topics, that to some extent can afford to wait. That, again, there are other places in international law where things can be done very speedily if the politics and the legal argument requires so. And International Law Commission's strength is precisely the iterative process, slow production of provisions, commentaries, feedback by states every autumn in the Sixth Committee in the International Law Week, and then taking that feedback and suggestions into account next year. And also, I think the point that not duplicating things that are being done elsewhere, a sort of very loose sense of subsidiarity, playing to one's strengths, not replicating things that specialized organizations are already doing or doing better. And it's, of course, very hard to say what is the thing of the added value, because the background politics can change. I think a very good example for that sometimes one doesn't really know whether a project fits a need or not, is the Commission's work on protection of atmosphere, something that the International Tribunal for Law of the Sea referred to approvingly in its opinion on climate change. But before that, if you read the materials in the Sixth Committee and the commentaries, it had a somewhat uneasy fit, and there were many things that the International Law Commission sort of self-delineated itself and said that we are not going to be dealing with that, but International Tribunal for Law of the Sea found particular propositions very helpful. So this is not strict science. Perhaps to some extent there's an element of art, an element of judgment of what fits the political and legal needs now and what might fit the international community in the future. And perhaps the last general point that I would want to make is the idea of taking multilingualism seriously. The three working languages in English, French, and Spanish, to the extent possible, working in parallel with these three documents. I was the chairperson of the drafting committee last year, and I have to say that it was intellectually fascinating. It was certainly posed challenges for controlling discussion if three language discussions of a particular provision were focusing on three very distinct issues that were found to exist in different languages. But that certainly strengthens the work of the Commission, and it enables drawing upon different styles of reasoning and different materials in a way that purely Anglophone and equally purely Francophone or purely a Spanish-speaking perspective would not. I would sort of, again, taking that seriously, and that of course requires a particular approach to work, a very practical sense, leaving time for translations and taking into account multilinguistic perspective. That I think strikes me as a very powerful expression. I think that's a professional deformation that I now find very hard to have a discussion on universal issues in a single language. It just seems that naturally there should be a third of the group who would be speaking in French and in Spanish, and that one would be switching off the microphones and doing translation matters. So these things I think are probably known to the such a sophisticated audience, and perhaps as a way of background. What has been done, there's a great deal of things that have been done on sources. Treaties in particular is a point on which the Commission has been very strong. And in the current agenda, there are three topics: general principle, subsidiary means, and non-legally binding arrangements. International responsibility and dispute settlement is something where on responsibility, the Commission has been very influential. On dispute settlement, somewhat less so, with just the model rules and article procedure there in the background. But I think as those of you who have followed specialized fields will know, for example, they were very influential in the drafting of the ICSID Convention, providing certain assumptions. And so currently, the Commission is looking at two topics on succession of states and state responsibility, and that settlement of disputes. Law of international spaces, so in the broader sense, is one more area of strength. Law of the sea, transboundary water law, guidelines on the protection of atmosphere that I mentioned, and sea level rise as a current topic for which there is a great deal of interest for states. So, the highlighted ones I will now in the second part of my presentation move in greater detail, but will simply say something briefly on the three that I am not highlighting here because they are not dealt in detail and substance this year so far. One is a topic that I'm sure is known to you, both on the merits and because of the new special rapporteur, is immunity of state officials from foreign criminal jurisdiction, for which Professor Claudia Grossman was elected last year as the special rapporteur. The third special rapporteur, taking over from Professor Escobar Hernandez, the second special rapporteur, who concluded the first reading before the end of the previous quinquennium. So this is something where we will start the work on the second reading just as we reconvene for the second half of the session on 1st of July. And the first report by the special rapporteur has been submitted, and when it has been translated in all the United Nations working languages, it will be put online likely within the next few weeks. So I will not say anything more about it, except perhaps to know that this is one of the topics that states are interested in. There are great questions of legal principle, and there are also grand political controversies. And the question, I think, will be about the legal contribution that the Commission can bring to the matter. The second topic, succession of states in respect of state responsibilities, currently dealt with by a working group chaired by August Reinisch, and it was a topic that was previously dealt with by Pavel Sturma as special rapporteur, but because he's not a member of the International Law Commission in the current quinquennium, there's a bit of a reflection by the International Law Commission of how to approach the next. And then the third topic is general principles of law. Again, a Latin American chaired topic. Marcelo Vázquez Bermúdez is the special rapporteur. It was adopted on the first reading last year. States have until the end of this year to provide comments on the first reading materials, and next year it will be addressed in the second reading. So many classic questions of sources of public international law, particularly the very intriguing category, the second category of general principles of law, general principles formed within the international legal system, in addition to perhaps the more traditionally accepted category of general principles derived from commonalities in domestic legal systems. So interesting and fun things, but to be dealt at a different point. Let me say now a bit more about the topics that are being dealt with on substance. The first, and probably one that for which there is the greatest interest by states, is the topic of sea level rise in relation to international law. It is dealt with not by the special rapporteur, but by study. And I think sort of it reflects the judgment of the International Law Commission in the previous quinquennium that this is something where a broad discussion of the issues and directions would be helpful in the beginning. And the format of the study group has been employed several times historically. Probably the ones that come to mind more recently is a study group chaired by Marty Costiniemi on fragmentation, and the study group chaired by now Judge Georg Nolte on treaties and time, which then led to Judge Nolte's appointment as a special rapporteur on treaty interpretation. So this study group was established in 2019 with 5 chairs, and Mr. Jacobo Cisse was then appointed as the special rapporteur on piracy. So 4 co-chairs have driven the work. Mr. Bogdan Arescu now on the International Court of Justice, and Madame Oral took the leadership on the first aspect, so effect of sea level rise on law of the sea. And Madame Galo Teles and Mr. Juan José de Santolaria took the second 2 topics. Madame Galo Teles with a focus on protection of persons, and Mr. de Santolaria the focus on statehood. And so it was sort of done in 2 circles They first produced 2 issues papers, and then in this quinquennium, additional papers to the first and the second issues papers. So what is the question? For the law of the sea, one might say that at its core, the very important issue can be conceptualized as relating to a particular question of law of the sea and identification of maritime spaces and boundaries. But the question whether baselines, so essentially the lines across the land territory from which the maritime entitlements are projected into maritime space, are viewed as ambulatory, essentially with the movement of the sea. They move forwards and backwards, or in some sense fixed, that they would not be affected by sea level rise in relation to climate change. And I think on this point, International Law Commission on its own served in the previous quinquennium the very helpful role as enticing, and perhaps to some extent one might even say provoking state practice, providing states an opportunity to formulate and express their views on the matter. And as International Law Commission and co-chairs have summarized, there has been a degree of a shift in the direction, and through somewhat different legal routes, many states have taken a view that it would make good sense. I think that there's a lot of careful reading of what reflects a view on the legal position and what reflects a view on the good policy destination for which different legal rules might be provided to protect the position of the affected states. So, a great deal of policy and political sympathy for small island developing states, least, as it were, guilty for climate change in this regard, most directly affected to some extent solidify their entitlements. At the same time, a very strong emphasis throughout on the cardinal and primordial role of UNCLOS and the balance of UNCLOS that should not be disrupted. And so this is something that that International Law Commission next year will be finalizing its work and proposing the way forward. I think that is probably sort of the lawyerly way of thinking through how to articulate the important concerns without disrupting the overall balance of UNCLOS, on which there is very strong support by states. On statehood and human rights, this is something that the National Law Commission Study Group has discussed this year, and you will see the summary in this year's report. But essentially, if for law of the sea, one could say that the question is a very important, but in a sense rather technical question of characterization of baselines. On statehood and human rights, the types of questions are different. On statehood is really a rather broadly posed question of whether the sea level rise and its effect on the land territory in a factual sense and inhabitability of that territory due to advancement of saltwater affects the usual conceptions of statehood, where state practice is really at the very early stages of development. There are some very interesting developments, and some of you might have read the news last year about the draft treaty between Tuvalu and Australia. So very interesting developments. And the second theme is human rights, where, again, unlike the other 2 points, a great deal is happening in a great deal of specialized settings at the universal level, at the regional level. And one has, I suppose, to think through it of being sufficiently concrete as to be helpful, but also not undermining developments that are taking place elsewhere. So the European Court of Human Rights a couple of months ago rendered a judgment against Switzerland regarding climate change. Last month, the International Tribunal for Law of the Sea, in its advisory opinion, did not address human rights directly, but in a passage noted the broader context of the existential threats and human dignity at play. Several judges, including Judge Infante, noted in their separate writings that broader context. I think that is something that states certainly are reflecting very, very carefully upon. And of course, the American Court of Human Rights had its own pleadings, and the opinion will be coming out. States have been given a bit of a deadline extension. I think that students would appreciate deadline extensions. States also appreciate deadline extension to protest on the second round of written statements. So it's sort of, these are things that are discussed in many settings. International Commission is certainly very conscious that this is not the only place in the international architecture where these points are dealt with. So that is one thing. Now for something completely different, I think, again, that is one of the things I perhaps cannot fully appreciate about the International Law Commission, how wonderfully messy and not connected all the topics are, representing in a way the very decentralized character of international law and things that states and other actors have to deal with. It's not, doesn't have the nice neatness that perhaps the PhD thesis might have just diving through on something. That one has to switch the mind from doing sea level rise in the morning and settlement of disputes with international organizations in the afternoon and piracy and immunity on the next day. So there has to be a certain degree of intellectual omnivariousness. You have to be interested in everything. What about, so this topic is one of three topics that were started last year, starting with this opinion, with special rapporteur August Reinisch. Last year, several changes were made. One was to change the title. The title that was originally proposed was Settlement of International Disputes. That was the syllabus that was proposed by Sir Michael Wood in 2016. And there the focus was international disputes in the sense of non-disputes arising under law other than international. And last year, after a great deal of discussion and taking into account comments of states, a view was taken that actually the most exciting and probably the most problematic or promising, probably depending on the perspective, developments are raised precisely in cases that do not necessarily raise international issues. So private law claims are brought by actors other than states, and the tension that might put sometimes on unities of international organizations for domestic courts. So that I think is sort of, I guess, the real life question that states and other actors are thinking about. So the one scenario that came up several times in the plenary discussion is the Haiti cholera case, questions about sort of a certain sense of, whether there might be cases where affected actors do not have a clear forum to go to, where broad immunities that generally pursue very, very important purposes of ensuring functions of organizations act so as to effectively block everything, and that there's no path towards which to go. And so that sense of access to justice, on access to forum, as an important consideration, particularly for claims brought by actors other than states or organizations, was something that was coming up quite a lot in comments by states. Last year, two guidelines were adopted. Sorry, I have three on the slide, but two were adopted. Apart from the point that I made about the scope of the project, the one point that last year gave rise to a great deal of discussion was the definition of international organizations. And that is something that the International Law Commission has dealt with several times. In 1986, sort of in the work that eventually became the Vienna Convention on Law of Treaties, also regarding international organizations, organizations were defined as intergovernmental organizations. And that, as you will appreciate when you reflect upon it, is not even descriptively accurate as a matter of contemporary practice. There are many organizations that have other international organizations as parties. So European Union, by way of example, is a party to many such instruments. It could be that there are actors that are neither states nor international organizations. We can think, customs territories within the World Trade Organization, or indeed actors that are perhaps a broader, looser sense of the broader civil society and community. So in 2011, within the work on articles on responsibility of international organizations, International Law Commission provided a broader definition for which the emphasis in the definition was on the possession of its own international legal personality. This approach is, it has certain intuitive attraction. Plainly, personality has something to do with subject of here, but it was also criticized, and it was criticized in particular by people coming from the international institutions, international organizations world. And for them, personality, so there was a degree of sloppiness in drafting. They felt that personality is a consequence of an organization being a subject rather than being an element of a definition. So expressing it in these terms sort of conflates layers of analysis. There was also a concern that it doesn't really provide a helpful analytical tool.
No, it's okay, it's okay.
Oh yes, there's a seat in front.
Yes. Sorry, because I was taking care of it.
One point was that, in a sense, kind of if you imagine that if you are sitting in a domestic court or in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and you're asked to determine whether some peculiar animal is an organization or it is not, if you are told, the decisive criterion is whether they have a personality, it's probably not going to be very helpful. Now, it may be that the particular institution's foundational instrument says one way or the other, but most don't. I mean, when they do, it's usually by reference to personality in domestic law. So there needs to be something that is more amenable to a way of asking questions. And within international institutional law, so if we look at the Blockers and Shermer's book on international institutions, the second underlined point about organ capable of expressing a will distinct from that of its members is the way how it is usually captured. And that is, you can immediately appreciate, there is a way of asking practical questions. You can imagine, sort of asking, what is your mandate? How do you exercise it? Have you had particular examples? And so on. And so that was essentially the Special Rapporteur's proposal to replace personality with a focus on one organ. And as a result of a broader discussion, a compromise proposal was adopted, whereas personality was retained, but also an emphasis was placed explicitly on an organ distinct, with a will distinct from that of its members. And there's a very interesting discussion by states in the system. Some states found it helpful, precisely for these practical reasons. Others felt that the 2011 definition actually worked reasonably well, and they didn't feel that there were broader issues there. This year, the Commission continued the discussion and looked more deeply on disputes between organizations and disputes between organizations and states. And the Special Rapporteur had prepared a very detailed example of practice of international organizations in that regard. I think what I would like to highlight here, and this is summarized in the chairperson's report that was released in the end of May. A big discussion was about the most efficient way of categorizing disputes. And there was a sense that there were different kinds of disputes, that disputes between an international organization and a state is a different sort of dispute from high-color dispute where victims are trying to bring a claim against the international organization. But there was disagreement of how to draw the line. Some people felt that the better way to draw the line, the more sort of traditional way to draw the line would be by reference to applicable law. That there are disputes on the basis of public international law and disputes on the basis of other fields of law, mostly domestic law. And so if I bracket here the question of the internal rules of the organization, something that the International Law Commission sort of dealt with in passing in the 2011 articles, but there is, I think, a degree of disagreement of what sort of animal, legally speaking, these internal rules are. But so one way would be to say there are public international law disputes and the character of subject is irrelevant. What matters is that there is an international law dispute or a non-international law dispute. A slightly different way would be to say that the categories are disputes between organizations and states, and disputes between organizations and actors other than organizations and states, mostly non-state entities. And there would be a significant degree of overlap, but not a complete one. So there are some, for example, investment arbitrations against the European Union that are directly on the basis of public international law. European Union may join European Convention of Human Rights, and then it could be responsible in that setting as well. And there are also arbitrations between organizations and individuals on the basis of public international law. So the Bank of International Settlements is one prominent example there. And as you can see from the plenary discussion, I inclined in that direction. It seemed to me that that was a more traditional lawyerly way of drawing distinction, one with which international law was quite familiar with, to the extent that we think about responsibility. Within the field of responsibility, that is how we would look at the applicable law. But ultimately, a consensus decision was taken that the neater way would be to look at subjects. Because subjects, perhaps in a very simplistic sense, that there's a particular kind of asymmetry in disputes between organizations and non-state actors that would be to a lesser extent present in disputes between organizations and states, which are, of course, extremely different, but in an important sense also recognizably different from disputes with non-state actors. And so that was the approach that is reflected here. We have these, which one might, with a great deal of caution, view as more horizontal type disputes. And so we have a language which draws, as you will see, to some extent on the Article 33 of UN Charter, Manila Declaration framework of the importance of good faith and spirit of cooperation, attention to the appropriateness of circumstance and nature of the dispute. Things shouldn't go to courts. that shouldn't be the preference. There's a very helpful memorandum that was prepared, to which organizations gave responses, and actually organizations seemed quite comfortable with mostly negotiating these solutions. There is a preference, a qualified one in Draft Guideline 5 as appropriate to perhaps can give more accessibility to formalize dispute settlement, but without prioritizing it, without saying that it's better or there should be more use. It should be more widely accessible. Let me just think I'll probably have about sort of 5 or 7 minutes. Still, I think that the audience is still, I think, attentive as far as I see. All right. And so next year, the thing I think probably that would be quite exciting. Next year, the third report would be that this would be the very practically, conceptually interesting questions of organization, private actor disputes, and again, as I expressed in my plenary statement, hopefully something more also on disputes involving internal rules of organization, because that is something where a great deal of interest comes in practice. The next topic, also something that was started last year, is subsidiary means for determination of rules of international law, the slightly cumbersome phrase that we know from 38(1)(d) of the ICJ statute that the French captures much more elegantly as la doctrine. So much more to the point. Last year, one thing that I thought was rather important one was a point made in draft conclusion 2, subparagraph C. So the acceptance that there may be other means in addition to decisions of courts and tribunals and teachings. It's not that free for all. It's a rather balanced expression generally used. So sort of building back, I guess, in a sense that there may be other things that are generally used in practice, and I think probably by implication accepted by the relevant authorities as being a subsidiary means, and therefore falling within the function of subsidiary means. There reasonable disagreement of how to articulate it. In my own plenary statement, I said that I would have been more comfortable of using essentially the same technique of you looking at how these things are done in practice to understand what decisions of courts and tribunals and teachings mean. That perhaps thinking of it as an evaluative concept or as a composite phrase might be more elegant and perhaps a more appropriately modest way of looking at it, that we shouldn't think that in 2020s we know everything about all the means that are there. The 38(1)(d) might look archaic, but I think in a way it's its great strength. It doesn't say much, but it is flexible enough to accommodate all the extraordinary expansion of international institutions for the last century. But these are workings by consensus, and ultimately International Law Commission concluded that it was important to explicitly highlight these matters. It is not something that has been dealt with yet, but it's as a footnote, as a signal that this is something that one would be dealing in the future. Draft conclusion 3 identifies the sort of things that one should be looking at in assessing the weight of subsidiary means, and this strikes me as potentially very important in practice. Not necessarily for, one might say, traditional courts and tribunals. I don't think that International Tribunal for Law of the Sea needs to be told what sort of criteria one needs to look at to weigh them. But there will be specialized tribunals, there will be domestic courts for which international law is not their daily bread and butter. And it's important that these institutions are told what sort of things you ask. You ask what sort of institution it is, how well they're researched, how representative it all is, how states and other entities receive it. I think that these are things that we probably would have all roughly thought intuitively we would look at in determining whether a particular piece of writing or a particular judgment is a good one or a bad one. But I do think it's helpful that it's spelled out. It's always, even very obvious things, if they are spelled out, it goes some way. Conclusions 4 and 5 go a bit further on courts and tribunals and teachings. I have to say that draft conclusion 4 broadly summarizes what ILC already said in the work on customary international law. Draft conclusion 5 goes a bit further. It emphasizes the importance of the breadth of representation, the various legal systems and regions of the world, and I think, and that was overall very positively received by states in the 6th committee, the last phrase of having regard to two kinds of diversity, linguistic diversity and gender diversity, which I think go to two slightly different elements of perhaps kind of ways for capturing universality at its best, as in the work of International Law Commission, and also emphasizing the focus on those aspects of representation that may have been historically, for a variety of reasons, disregarded. And so that was viewed by the Commission as making an important point that was important to make, and states, I think, overall agreed. Those states that spoke about it mostly emphasized their agreement. 3 draft conclusions were adopted this year, and they fall into 2 categories. Draft conclusion 6 speaks about nature and function of subsidiary means, and it says that they are not a source of law, but their function is to assist with determination of existence and content. Now, you might say to some extent it makes an obvious commonsensical point, but sometimes commonsensical points are worth being said as well. And at least in my plenary statement, I suggested that perhaps it might make sense to eventually move this draft conclusion somewhere to the very front, so that the reader gets the point immediately. Paragraph 2 goes to a somewhat narrower point that, as you know, there are different things that different tools can do. So a domestic court judgment, for example, can explain what international law is, and in that sense, it is a subsidiary means. But it is also a piece of state practice and opinio juris. And so paragraph 2 is a simply without prejudice clause that we are familiar with it, that particular materials can be doing 2 things simultaneously. And the fact that it's a subsidiary means doesn't mean that it is not something else. Draft conclusions 7 and 8 go to the judicial point. And there, what we are saying is that they may be followed as a descriptive matter, but they are not legally binding unless otherwise provided for. And so that reflects the general default position in public international law that judgments are not binding, but also provides appropriate leeway for special rules. And in the discussion, it actually came out that there were quite a lot of specialized examples where, for particular purposes, judgments were binding at the international level. The European Court of Justice has in its statute a rule which says that judgments are legally binding precedents. Within European Union law, the European Free Trade Agreements Court has to treat the judgments of the Court of Justice as binding for certain purposes. Within hierarchical structures, within criminal law and administrative review tribunals, there may be binding. So it's important not to say that that is a general rule, because it's plainly not, but also not to undermine the possibility to create it. And then draft conclusion 8 adds some specialized aspects in addition to draft conclusion 3 as probably Judge Infante Coffee will appreciate, we benefited from the work of the Institute and the NGA resolution on precedent in that regard. So that is, I think, a good example of mutual borrowing from different bodies here. I will probably not say a great deal about piracy and armed robbery at sea. I gather that that's probably not a focal point of Chilean international law community at the moment, but just to say that this is something where the language adopted last year largely traces, or at least the attempt was to trace as much as possible, the customary law expressed in UNCLOS and the practice of the International Maritime Organization. And what was adopted this year was also rather sort of a general statement building to some extent on UNCLOS. I have come to the very last point, something that is of great interest of states, the non-legally binding international agreements, which we will start discussing in the second half with a new special rapporteur, Matthias Fortol, looking at identification of these arrangements and their potential legal effect, which may be direct or indirect. And I think, again, this is a sophisticated audience, but you will appreciate why that is important. But this is extremely important for states, I think. From all of these topics, lots and lots of things that are done in international relations and affairs are not done through the treaties, but through non-binding arrangements, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for less good reasons. But in either way, it's very important for there to be greater clarity on drawing the line and legal implications of falling on this part of the line. And that is all.
Very good. Thank you very much. About the categories, about the functions of international commission in order to render more functional also and relevant international law. Now we have time for questions and comments. Please raise your hands. You are invited. And if you don't feel able to speak English, please do that in Spanish, no problem. There is a question here. Yes, please. You may identify yourself.
Okay,
Yes,
thank you. I'm very grateful to have this chance to attend this activity. My name is María Solís Diobando. I'm Assistant Consul for Victims in the International Criminal Court. And my question is not exactly related with the lecturer, but is very pertinent in relation to the work that the International Law Commission done, and specifically related to the article of responsibility of wrongful acts of the state. I don't know if it's possible
to.
You
want to raise every question?
Okay,
please.
Well, my English is not perfect. Then I
know.
Okay. I think maybe the most important work that the International Law Commission done is the RCWA. You work a lot in that, almost 50 years, to looking for all the international customary law in relation to the state responsibility. And currently, when we see the news about the West Bank and the Gaza conflict, I think about that in relation to prevent more damage. For example, right now, we look the news and also we follow the development of the judicial movement in the International Criminal Court for the individual responsibility and the international responsibility of the state in the International Court of Justice, and specifically in relation to starvation. And we know that in the place, there are food already. There are different containers with food, and it's materially possible to prevent more damage. But for that, we need someone, maybe a commander, with enough courage to open the container and provide food with different people. And we know in the place there is not just Hamas belligerent and also the Israel commanders, but there is other type of militaries, for example, American militaries. And I think, do you think it's possible, for example, use the Article 25 of the RCWA, the necessity? Do you think that this is possible, have a justification to open that type of container and establish a precluding circumstances of an international wrongful act?
Quite a topic.
Okay.
In your field,
I don't know if you can follow me because I know my English is.
You know, it was very clear. I think it was probably just sort of, I guess, situating it. So, I mean, I think in terms of analytical distinctions and what the legal argument can help us with. I think the distinction that we are probably accustomed with from international law commission's work is between primary rules, which tell us what the obligations are, and secondary rules that are surrounding them as a default matter, as also circumstance precluding wrongfulness, as you say. Also, there would be a distinction between state responsibility and individual responsibility. It's one of the concluding provisions in the ILC 2001 articles and sort of the corresponding country provisions in the ICC work, and it has been kind of confirmed that these are autonomous. I'm not sure that the question, that the issue would arise in particularly those, that is the legal concern that in a sense is driving practical considerations. So it doesn't seem to me that this is something that where a particular, so to get to the necessity point, one would have to get to a point where a particular state is under obligation, I guess, sort of not to interfere in, to provide food. So it's sort of, I think I'm not sure whether the factual scenario maps together with that. I would say that something that ILC does provide is the overall tenor of thinking about such matters, and that is what comes from Article 41. Something that in Article 41 ILC then described as progressive development of obligations of lawful cooperation to preclude the continuation of serious breaches of jus cogens rules and associated rules on non-provision of aid and non-recognition. And in the draft conclusions on jus cogens, ILC said that this is no longer progressive development. So that I think at least provides sort of, I guess, the vector for thinking through what conduct is desirable and what is undesirable. And that, I think, strikes more the legal political dynamic than the circumstance precluding wrongfulness issue.
Thank you. Astrid, I would like to invite Andrés Delgado, please.
Thank you, Professor Infante. Martin, thank you very much for the presentation. I have two questions that are not related between each other because your presentation was so wide-ranging. The first one has to do with the first part of your presentation about the ILC and the instruments. And you mentioned how the form that the work of the ILC takes place, like in conclusions, principles, guideline reports, sometimes changes depending on the aesthetic choice of the rapporteur. And I wanted to press you a little bit on this and thinking whether you think that it should have other kinds of logic, whether when the ILC decides to have a guideline should be for because of the topic in itself, because of how right it is the topic on itself to be discussed and to see a little bit about that, your thoughts about that. And the other one that I heard was about the settlement of disputes to which international organizations are parties and the definition of international organization. And when listening to you, I was wondering whether the idea of international legal personnel was enough. Because if you are also going to be looking at domestic disputes and cases of international courts, of international organizations being parties to cases in domestic courts, perhaps also the domestic element of that legal personality should be part of the definition. And those were the two that I have. Thanks a lot once again for the seminar.
Thank you, Andres. Great questions, and a pleasure to see you again. It is an ongoing discussion, I think. So I guess really it's sort of at the meta level of whether nomenclature should be viewed as indicating juridical differenceness, or perhaps whether, we can sort of say, well, there are articles are those that can in principle be a basis for convening a conference and adopting a treaty, which is sort of the point that the statute of the ILC makes, and other things. And there are several schools of thought historically among the ILC members and also among states. So there are some states that are very insistent on the importance of clarity of nomenclature, which I think is part of the broader insistence of clarity of distinction between codification and progressive development, so that there is, I think probably in a practical sense, one might imagine that those are sophisticated actors that are sometimes a bit peeved that courts take ILC more seriously than those actors think ILC should be taken, and that they would want ILC to be more explicit in flagging that something may be desirable but it's not law, and a particular type of output format that is viewed as indicating it would go that way. At the same time, I think that is also one of the things that perhaps, discovering all the rich history of ILC, that there's more to it than articles and state responsibility. Actually, other forms, Nuremberg principles were one of the first products that ILC adopted. So it's not the case that in the good old times it was articles and then ILC started to get fluffy. So the subtlety and actually, general endorsement of Nuremberg principles as a good form of expressing that point was there for the very beginning. So, the form of the three new projects was discussed last year, and there were two different forms. So, on guidelines to organizations, the sense was that that guidelines in some sense capture that normativity and possible flexibility of precisely how it would be captured. So it would be kind of a mixture of various things of guiding what desirable practice would be. And there's a sense that a guideline captures that very, very, very neatly. On the other 2 points, I have to say that my own preference as to output remained in the minority. So perhaps I have to approach it with a degree of caution. So on piracy and armed robbery at sea, I felt that really for me, the primordial consideration was not in any way affect or even seem to affect UNCLOS and associated customer international law. And I feel that to the extent that we get into articles and the potential treaty making, it is extraordinarily hard to completely exclude that possibility. I mean, we know from the old cases like case that very well, Knox plants, the point that Crawford made that even seemingly similar textual expression might have different meaning because context is different and object purpose is different. So I was just approaching it with a great deal of caution and felt that something like conclusions might be a better thing. The drafting committee, I think, under my own chairmanship, but in that position I have to be neutral on the merits, concluded provisionally that articles was a better form, but in my statement it was explained that it was open. But one can sort of see, and I think that there the argument of those who took a different view was to say, well, if we are proposing, for example, rules of extradition and criminal cooperation, these are not things that you can have other than on the basis of the treaty. There's some, I guess, almost policy points on the best fit and a direction of project. Subsidiary means where the special rapporteur proposed, and most members accepted that it should be dealt with as conclusions because he viewed them as very close to the work on sources. So there was customary law and general principles. And so subsidiary means sort of logically concludes the first paragraph of 38. So that was conclusions. This should be conclusions. I was a bit contrarian. I felt that precisely for that reason, they shouldn't be conclusions because subsidiary means are not sources. The point that ILC just made. So I felt precisely for that reason, a guideline might be a nicer way of putting it. And if you look at, I think some of the things that are there that are plainly reflections of customary or some, like on the criteria of weight, I'm not entirely certain. And then there's some states, I think UK was a state who said it in the 6th committee that, for conclusions, we expect that we are pointed to state practice and sort of such things. And while for the considerations of weight, they're perhaps presented in commentaries as logical inferences of the character of the order or references to ILC's earlier work. So it's a long way of saying that there's a subtlety in there, and I have probably concluded that I am less certain about it than when I started it. On the second question, I will say, concisely, I think that is something that will be dealt with. So the second question was whether international legal personality is enough, whether we should look at domestic legal personality. And that is, of course, something that was key in many of the most quoted. Tin Council was ultimately a case that really turned not on international law, but almost on British corporate law to some extent. That will be something I think that will be very much on the special rapporteurs and commission's mind next year, because of the distinction and the way how it has been drawn. Next year it would have to be faced. And well, ultimately, if there's a sense that other things need to be adjusted, it's possible. Probably the only, I would have actually to think through myself, I wouldn't want to commit, but probably the only one thing to say that these are definitions for the purposes of the project, in a sense that they are not driven that much by a, kind of like a general sense of wanting to state the definition for all the purpose. But of course, if it is needed for this particular purpose, that might come in, but that is perhaps something that permits a greater deal of subtlety and practical adjustments.
Very good, thank you very much. There is one, first Paula and then María. María? Yes, very good. Identify us, please.
Good afternoon, Professor Paparinskis. I'm Paula Cortés, Assistant Professor of Public International Law at Universidad de Chile. And I would like to ask two questions for you. The first question is about the immunity of state officials topic. And my question is that, thinking that now is in the second reading, and knowing that the Commission, of course, is not isolated from what is going on in the world. I remember I had the chance to be visiting the Commission in 2018, and when Professor Escobar Hernandez was presenting the topic, I felt that from some states, they were very reluctant to work on this topic or to try to be very progressive about it. Because I think this topic is one that I think the desire to the aim of the topic is then that the state can maybe do a convention about it, right? It's not guidelines, it's not conclusions. So my first question is, with the war now in Ukraine, or with the reactivation of the conflict in Palestine, do you think this could permeate the second reading or the future of this topic? So that is the first question. And the second question is probably more personal. Do you think that, or is there any topic that you think it might be super important to analyze for the Commission, that you think, okay, this is a topic that the Commission, like in the future program, I mean. So thank you very much.
Thank you. On the second one, I think I'll just so say it. I will defer my answer until the report is here. On the first, I think I'll probably be quite, so essentially the question of whether the great potential relevance of the topic of immunities in light of ongoing conflicts in different parts of the world, I guess, makes it easier, makes it harder. So I'll probably be quite, I suppose, sort of a bit cryptic in that regard. I think for, I mean, recall, questions that come to the International Law Commission should be hard. The criteria for selection of topics are that these are things that, where there's a need for states to address it, and that there is enough state practice. So easy and uncontroversial things, states are probably going to say, we don't think that it should be dealt with there. That is a valuable resource. It certainly is interesting if we look at the comments by states and compare sort of the interventions on particular issues, that there were states that have intervened throughout with positions essentially unchanged. There are states that have intervened throughout and their positions have shifted. There are states that have really intervened only in reaction to the first reading and only in relation to one or two particular provisions. And I think it will be interesting to see, you know, sort of intervention in the future. As one imagines that interventions that had to be submitted by 1st December last year might have reflected assumptions that would be different if they had to be submitted by 1st of December this year. I will not say anything about how states might receive Commission's work afterwards. That is for the Sixth Committee and states in their wisdom to proceed. From a legal perspective, I think ultimately these are questions that international lawyers and law are well equipped to answer. We consider questions of the representativeness of practice, of consistency of practice, between states and also, in a sense, within states, whether domestic courts, the executive, legislature, public pronouncements have been internally consistent, or whether they have been flip-flopping or coming in only at one point. And the ILC study on custom gives us a very clear answer that reflects the way to be given. There is a premium for states to have good international lawyers who ensure that, to be a bit casual, that ducks are always in the row, that state always speaks with one voice in all settings, to the extent that a state can ensure that its position will carry great weight, to the extent that executive speaks in one direction, judiciary in the other, and flip-flops every few years will affect its weight. So they are the bigger politics, but they do not affect our capacity to answer the legal questions. And in a general sense, I think the fact that there is more practice and more interest, that must be good, because you know, whatever one considers a desirable rule is, the fact that these are important issues where we want as much and as broad state involvement as possible, that strikes me kind of at the macro level, other things being equal, a good thing.
Thank you very much. We have another question, Maria. Could be the last one. Are you tired? Yes, you must be.
Yes.
Maria, and then there was the gentleman, yes, at the back, but you can approach him afterwards. My name, please.
Thank you, Professor. This was extremely interesting. My name is María, and I'm an international resolution practitioner, mainly in the field of investor-state dispute. And while I heard your presentation on the question of the settlement of disputes between international organizations and non-state actors, that made me also reflect on the current impulse to hold corporations accountable for climate change related harm. And while there is a lot of potential for international courts to hold states accountable for climate change related harm, I want to have your views on whether there's any space for international courts to hold corporations and non-state actors accountable for climate change related damage.
Thank you. As you will be familiar, as I sort of alluded to in my talk, lots of courts and tribunals are dealing with that. And without sucking up to Judge Infante coffee, as she said in her declaration, that there is that delicacy that each institution operates within the limits of their jurisdictional mandate, but also within the broader normative universe. So there is that delicate sensitivity that tribunals cannot ignore it, but they also can do what they can, in a sense, within the functional framework that they have been set up. And most international courts and tribunals are not set up to consider such claims directly. Now, there may be implications. So before the International Tribunal for Law of the Sea, for example, there were states that argued that there was great relevance, for example, for investment protection treaties, and they felt that actually the, I guess, teleology of investment protection treaties was essentially incompatible with the environmental rules and the climate change rules. You know, that is a position that the European Union has taken very recently in withdrawing from the Energy Charter Treaty. But that is not something that a tribunal went in, or I think any of the individual judges. So I think that that sort of speaks within that there may be the broader normative universe that I guess really seeps in, and then a normative universe that is further removed in the background. So I think that the answer must be that this is where domestic law must take the driver's seat. And I think the takeaway from sort of developments in counterclaims cases, like Perenco and Burlington and Ecuador, I think that they tell us that to the extent that domestic law provides far-reaching rules on responsibility of corporate actors for environmental issues, investment arbitration tribunals will be very open to implementing it within the limits of that mandate. But in a sense that states have to do their work in that regard. And so I think that that is a fascinating development, I guess, really cases coming from all possible angles, sort of a bit of a bottom-up anti-corporate cases, coming from Urgenta, but also sort of across the world, including in Latin America, and possibly kind of legislative wishes in that direction. It's interesting, and I think it will be very interesting to see when oral proceedings in ICJ case start and the written statements are released. I think that states are thinking kind of not in an abstract sense, but in a very practical sense, because a lot of money and policy calls turn on this. So it's a great question. I think that lots of very smart international lawyers are thinking precisely about that right now.
Some of them may be present here. So we'll be working on the subject, which is very not only hot subject, but it's very urgent, because states cannot work in isolation, and they don't have sometimes the tools to work in isolation. They have to work with the actors, state and non-state actors that are playing already, yes, on their territories. Well, thank you very much. We have to put end to this very substantive and a very encouraging session. You know, the International Commission is attracting students to cooperate with the members of the International Commission. I mean, members are allowed to have assistants who go there to participate in some studies, so that is also another sub-area or subtopic of this lesson. Thank you very much. It has been a privilege for the Institute to have me here. And I hope that the pictures and photographs were active in order to disseminate this very nice conversation. And if you would like to have coffee or juice with some of the participants, you are invited. Thank you.